point here on India at 9 this evening. The unfolding Iraq crisis. Will the Modi government find it tough to rein in inflation? Of course, there are many other parameters. But on your screens, my very prolific panel joining us on India at 9. I'm being joined by Narendra Taneja. He's the National Convener Energy Cell for the BJP. Leela Ponnappa, the former Deputy National Security Advisor. Vikram Mehta, the former Chairman of the Shell Group of Companies, joining me from Mumbai. Atul Aneja, the Associate Editor of Strategic Affairs for the Hindu newspaper. And in a short while from now, we hope to be joined by Mani Shankar Iyer, coming in here as a congressman and also the former Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas. Good evening, gentlemen. Good evening, Madam Ponnappa. Thanks very much for joining me here on India at 9. Iraq's descent, in a sense, into this unchecked chaos obviously has many ramifications, and I'm hoping to delve into each one of them, political, diplomatic and economic. But as I mentioned in that opening, one of the first commodities to fluctuate is oil. Vikram, I come to you first. This is obviously going to hit India hard, specifically since we know Iraq is the second largest oil supplier to this country.
Well, the oil market has been very tightly balanced for the last couple of years, and today we are seeing a situation where there is a real possibility of a spike. Clearly, if the ISIS were to move south, which is where 3/4 of Iraq's reserves are, prices could go anywhere up to $150, $160 a barrel. Today, they still haven't impacted Iraq's export capability because most of the crisis is concentrated in the north. That said, of course, the major field in Kurdistan, which is the Kirkuk field, the pipeline connecting that to the refineries has been damaged by the rebels.
True.
Now, frankly, what we are seeing are certain fundamentals repeat themselves. One is that the oil market is fundamentally volatile. 60% of the OPEC production comes from the Middle East, which is currently redrawing its boundaries.
True.
Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, there are sanctions in Iran. So this is a fundamental. We cannot afford, as India and a country that's importing 80% of its crude oil, to ignore the fact that we will be importing a product that is volatile and from an area that is subject to major geopolitical uncertainties and upheavals.
You know, Vikram,
so that's
it's
really, I think, what we have to...
It's interesting you say that, and I'm sorry to interrupt, because I want you to look at what the government's dilemma at this point in time would be. If you allow oil companies to raise fuel prices, the Brent constantly going up, this is going to push in inflation. This is a new government that is already trying to put in measures to tame inflation. If there are low retail fuel prices, that is really going to mean this mounting subsidy bill, which the government also wants to prune.
Yeah, you know, energy and oil sit at the nub of politicians' deepest dilemmas.
True.
How do they meet the demands of their electorate for cheap, affordable and secure supplies of fuel? At the same time, how do they control the fiscal ramifications? Now, this dilemma cannot be resolved by totally ignoring the market. So one of the major steps that the government must not sort of lose track of is the importance of ensuring that the oil companies in India continue to have the freedom to price the product in a manner that's aligned to the market. That doesn't mean that we remove the subsidies totally. We can't. There are many millions of people who cannot afford market-related prices for LPG
Sure.
or diesel or kerosene. But those subsidies must be now provided from the exchequer. There will be an inflationary impact. You can do nothing about it because of our dependence on imports. But this impact will be compounded if we continue to misalign prices in a way that basically leaves some future company or future government to pay the bill. So we have to actually recognize that at this juncture there is no substitute but to ensure that the price of oil is market oriented.
The price of oil is market oriented.
Last point I'd make is, of
Sure.
course, that we will be able to control demand by ensuring that prices are related to the market.
You know, you said the price of oil needs to be market oriented, and at least in the near future there is only going to be this government for the next 5 years, so they need to foot the bill as well. But just very quickly, Vikram, before I go on to my other panelists, if the situation continues to deteriorate the way it is and ISIS increases its footprint, what would the figure that we could be looking at in the near future?
Well, I'm not a soothsayer, but as I said in my opening remark, if the reserves and the production of oil and gas from the southern fields of Iraq were impacted, it would dramatically affect Iraq's export capability.
True.
Today, Iraq is exporting 2.5 million barrels. So prices could go into the, beyond 150, because Saudi Arabia does not have the production capability to offset the shortage of crude oil coming out of Iraq.
Okay. Atul Areja, let me bring you in, and I'm stitching it from where Vikram left.
Total export capabilities were affected.
Yeah. Okay. Atul, come in here. Vikram made that point about the ISIS concentration in northern Iraq, in a sense, and much of the oil production really happening in the south. Do you believe in the short term, in a sense, India is safeguarded?
Well, the crucial aspect would be what happens now. There's too much of echo. Yeah.
Go ahead, Atul. We can hear you.
If the game changer would be the southern, the game changer would be what happens in the south because of these fields of Rumaila, West Kurna, Majnoon. If anything happens there, in case of intrusion, you're likely to see a retaliation by the Shias over there, who are likely to be backed by Iran. So Iran gets drawn into it. Then we get into a different kind of a geopolitical dynamic with Iran and Saudi Arabian competition coming in. And there's a bigger picture over here. Once Saudi Arabia and Iran comes in, and the possibility of US strikes, you've seen ships already being positioned in the Persian Gulf and being beefed up. That would create a different kind of a scenario, which will have, a definite impact. The geopolitical aspects would drive prices much harder. I would agree with your earlier speaker that we could then see a spiral reaching something like $150 or so, which is terrible for a country like India.
Narendra Taneja, that certainly complicates this government's economics, this government's math. I think every time the rupee depreciates by about 1 against the US dollar, you're adding about 8,000 crores to the fuel subsidy bill. So how worried, I'm just wondering how worried and how closely is the government looking at this unfolding crisis?
Well, first of all, the whole world is worried, not only India. I mean, all large importing countries like India, China, we are all worried. But at the same time, let's not forget one thing. When we look at southern Iraq, in southern it's a majority of operators. They are international players. They come from Britain, from France, from China, and number of other Japanese and number of other countries, and they are all there. Right now, the picture is, as we speak, the production is on, and the people down there and the companies are operating. I've been interacting with a couple of these companies just 2 hours ago, and look, it's fine. There's, of course, they're very worried. They have put in place, some contingency plans and things like that. And let's not forget one thing. Southern part of Iraq is a Shia majority area, and Iran is a Shia majority. Majority of oil producing area in Saudi Arabia are also Shia, dominant areas. So there is Shia Sunni factor, and at the same time, I think new diplomatic initiatives have been launched, and I personally feel that India, in big importing countries like India, China, South Korea, Japan, and Europe, they should join hands and launch a diplomatic initiative as soon as possible, so that we can contain it. The whole thing should be localized as soon as possible. It is in Iran's interest, it is in the interest of Saudi Arabia, I hope, and of course the Western countries. So I think, why I'm explaining all this, because we don't need to really press the panic button as yet. because there are a lot of other complexities involved, and the world is actually working to find a solution within the UN and also more importantly outside the UN, and India is very much involved. And
okay, so Narendra, you're making that important, you're making that important point, but I'm only looking at it, and you're talking about that collective diplomatic effort that really could come in from many countries who are big oil exporting countries. But I'm just looking at a little bit of the micro picture, just looking at India, considering the latest inflation figures. The new Prime Minister already talking of tough measures, wanting to bring in cut down some amount of subsidies on fuel, trying to bring in some kind of fiscal prudence. You don't believe it may not be fair to press the panic button at this stage, but this could certainly spoil the party to some extent.
Well, I wouldn't say spoil the party. You see, look, India is taking, that's very much on the radar. The government is already taking, some steps. The steps have been put in place. That includes conservation, asking government of India companies, also private companies, to be more efficient, and of course, asking government of India companies to start producing more wherever they can. So that's being done. But let's understand one thing. When it comes to external factors such as this, there is very little India, for that matter, any other country can do. We have to live with those, but at the same time, we need to mobilize whatever we can and put in place contingency plans, and that is being done. But having said that, at the same time, I mean, we are watching it, India is watching it very closely, BJP is watching it very closely, and at this stage we all want to say is that diplomatic efforts initiative must be launched. We should try to contain the situation there, and there is absolutely no need to press the panic button as
no need to press the panic button. Manishankar Iyer, would you agree with that assessment?
If only what I had stressed as Petroleum Minister, that we must have in place a system of oil diplomacy which brings in producers and consumers of Asia together and run this as a regular forum with great enthusiasm and zeal, then maybe we would already have in position all those mechanisms that would need to be deployed in a crisis like this. But if one attempts to create such a mechanism in the middle of a crisis, I'm not quite sure how successful it will be, but I give them the best of luck. I must add that when I became the Petroleum Minister, which was at the start of UPA 1, then the price of oil was a little under $30 a barrel.
True.
And in our time, we saw it go up by 4 to 5 times. And still we were able to handle it. But in the face of constant sniping from both the right and the left as to the kind of policies that we were undertaking. But frankly, I see no alternative to that. The price of oil in the Indian market, I'm talking about crude oil, is already aligned to world prices. Any rise in crude oil prices is immediately reflected in domestic crude oil prices. The point is not whether oil prices are market oriented, but what do you do about petroleum products whose prices, if they were to rise gently, could easily be accommodated within a framework of allowing market forces to determine the prices of petroleum products. But when prices of petroleum products shoot up exponentially, then obviously the government has also to take exponential security measures to safeguard the lives of the people. And we also need to have worked far more than we have on diversifying our sources of supply, not only of oil, but also of gas.
Also of gas.
And finally,
I'll get Vikram.
I would wish to stress.
Mr. Iyer, just one point. I'll get Vikram also to respond to it. But my question is, do you believe Mr. Jaitley would have to perhaps go back to the drawing board a little bit more? The government, has had in its head plans to really free diesel prices from administrative fixing, reduce fiscal prudence, etc. In the light of these developments that are unfolding, do you believe there will have to be a little bit of rethinking? Mr. Iyer, that question for you.
Oh, the question is for me. Not a little bit of rethinking. They'll have to do a great deal of rethinking on fundamentals. The fact of the matter is, as Vikram indicated towards the end of his intervention, that government is obliged in the short run to look after the welfare of the people. And if this imposes a fiscal burden on them, they will have to take a choice as to whether they want people to suffer on this account or whether there are going to be long-term deleterious effects. The fact of the matter is that all democracies have a life of 5 years and a window of opportunity of a few weeks. And that window of opportunity is fast closing on the BJP government, and I don't think they have any alternative to doing anything very much different to what we ourselves did.
What you
These
did,
are
Vikram,
the compulsions of the economic system.
Fair enough. Vikram, would you agree with that assessment that that window of opportunity is fast closing? And some of the measures that the BJP would actually put in would be the ones that
No,
Go ahead.
No, I don't think the window of opportunity is closing. I think the reality is that this government, just as the previous government, is facing a severe fiscal crisis. There is a need to consolidate the finances. So there has to be some scaling back of subsidies. Now, that objective, of course, is going to be difficult to achieve in light of the hike in oil prices, assuming that we do see a substantial hike. It hasn't happened yet.
True.
Now, how the government then allocates the subsidy burden, whether they indeed decide to subsidize oil as they've done in the past, or whether they scale back on the subsidies of other commodities, whether it's food or fertilizers, is a question that will be posed, or that will be confronted by Mr. Jaitley, the finance minister.
Right.
But there is no escaping from the reality that there is no free lunch. We will have to pay international market price one way or the other. And if the price of oil does shoot up, there's going to be an inflationary impact. It's going to impact the fiscal deficit or the budget. And the question then is, will it also impact the oil companies who have currently borne the burden of the subsidies? My own point was that the government can no longer compound this problem by destroying or undermining the balance sheets of their own companies who are required to invest in exploration and production of hydrocarbon resources in this country, who are required to ensure that the refineries are producing products safely and within an environmental standard, and who are required to ensure that the product that reaches the customer is also secure and reliable.
Okay.
Then that's been undermined by the government policies in the past.
Okay. Vikram, I'll have to make you pause here. Leela Ponnappa has been listening to this discussion very patiently. Ma'am, I'd like you to come in here. You know, many of the panelists have been pointing to the fact, Atul, for instance, made that point about the saving grace at this stage for countries like India is that the ISIS operations are largely centered towards the north. Much of that oil production is happening in the south. I think there are two comments that perhaps came in from the Finance Secretary and the RBI Governor as well, saying that we're also looking at this crisis blowing over. From the situation as it stands, do you think that is a possibility?
I think there's something very serious going on in Iraq, and I don't think we should delude ourselves into thinking that this is a simple, small crisis that is going to blow over. There are fundamental forces that go way back in history to the drawing of the borders after World War I. And the fact that Iraq itself never stabilized after the two Gulf Wars itself is an indication that you don't yet have closure on some of the many very serious issues that are affecting the region. So I do believe that the government would need to prepare for a very serious situation. In fact, as Vikram and the others were talking, my mind went back to the first oil shock of 1973, when we had to deal with the measures taken by OPEC after, you know, and the price of oil shot up, and it was followed by hyperinflation. So I think certain things are going to be inevitable. I heard talk of the subsidies and LPG. The LPG goes to the middle class, and I don't see the incentives even at a domestic level for things like solar easy and incentivized so that people go for it. So I think there are measures that the government has to take internally. The whole pricing aspect has been dealt with great expertise expertise by your former speakers.
Right.
But I think what's happening is that the strategic domain here includes the economic aspect and the socio-political aspect. Because while on the one hand you have the ISIS moving forward and the kind of conflict, don't forget what's happening in Pakistan and Afghanistan as well. You know, where I think you have a tremendous resurgence of the Taliban.
Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt because I was only pushing on the diplomatic point. Considering New Delhi has maintained somewhat decent, good relations, if I can call it, with the Iraqi government. Over the past 2 years, Iraq has really risen as our second biggest supplier of crude oil, as I've been mentioning. The question is, how far should India go in this crisis? Manishankar Iyer talked about a collective diplomatic effort, but how far should New Delhi push in this crisis, if it should at all?
Well, I think the crisis goes to show the importance of a country like India taking its own decisions, for example, and maintaining a certain equation with Iran, where unfortunately I do believe that there were pressures that were put on the former government, and that there was a certain dilution of our positions. Iran is the fulcrum, it's the key to the whole situation in the Gulf. It dominates the entire northern coast of the Gulf. It has connectivity into Afghanistan, Central Asia and the Caucasus, and it is a major energy producer.
True.
But yet I think there were hiccups, shall I say, in the relationship. And I think if one thing it demonstrates, is very clearly demonstrated now, India has to take its own decisions in dealing with this region. Absolutely, I think Mani is absolutely right. As minister, he was very creative in identifying alternative sources, and that is something that the government needs to pursue with great activism. Because if you look at a global map of India's energy security countries, I can assure you it would be very different from the map that exists with regard to the so-called political relations. Where Sudan is important, Angola and Mozambique are important, Vietnam is important, and these are some of the areas. Russia, of course, has been a supplier as well, and these are the areas where I think we need to develop a kind of conjoining of forces that Mani spoke about, in order to try to bring some equilibrium into the situation.
And I think that's an important differentiation that you're making about what the map would look like if we looked at energy security, oil security, and if we looked at our political relations. I want to come back to you, Leela Ponnappa, for just a question on people, in a sense, Indian citizens there, but I'll do that in just a bit. Atul, let me get you in, and my question to you really is twofold. Can the Iraqi government at this point in time handle this crisis without any foreign intervention? And if no, Iran's already in the picture in some sense. Whether we're going to see American strikes in coordination with, ground forces that are coming in from Iran, I think it's a clear indication that these are desperate times and they call in for desperate measures.
Absolutely. I think it is an extremely volatile situation, and as we have seen that after the US invasion of Iraq, we have had a very fragility of the society, from whose national identity has been diminished to great extent, and there was perhaps a deliberate encouragement to create sub-identities like Sunnis, Shias and Kurds, and that was enshrined within the constitutional framework as well. So the identity of Iraq has been diminished very greatly, and there are deep fissures within the society which have generated over the past years. I don't see Nuri al-Maliki's government having the clout or a strong center being there to keep the unity of the state and fight ISIL on its own without external forces getting into it. So I am not at all hopeful about the situation sort of unfolding in Iraq, and that's of huge consequence to us. I would just pick up on a point of what Leela Ponnappa said about Iran being so important to our energy security and the need to have a very independent framework of energy policies which is India-centric and Asia-centric, rather than being dictated by forces who might have their own vested interests.
Okay. Independent framework of our policy when it comes to energy security. We're really in the last stretch, in a sense, of this debate, and I'm going to stitch it all back together. Leela Ponnappa, I want to come to you for a quick comment. There is already a travel advisory by the Indian government and steps are being taken to help Indian citizens. But I remember in that past crisis, there were many Indians who were stuck. They'd gone to Iraq as truck drivers on private contracts, whether it was for US companies or Saudi companies. Many of them were kidnapped. There was also killing in a sense. And then you found that the employers were were not willing to negotiate in return for safety. Do you believe the government needs to put in more proactive measures at this point in time?
I think given the nature of the crisis in Iraq and what I understand from my former colleagues in government, they are working round the clock in terms of keeping in touch with Indian nationals or with groups of Indian nationals in different parts of the country. But I do believe that we should be confident about the government, our Air Force and whoever else is involved in doing the best that they can in a given situation. Obviously, we do not control the situation in Iraq.
True.
I'm told that the road into the areas controlled by the ISIS groups are also unsafe. There are 46 nurses holed up in one particular hospital. There are others scattered all over. But don't forget that this is a country that evacuated over 300,000 Indian nationals from Kuwait, that handled the evacuation from Lebanon with a turnaround of Indian naval ships in the middle of the Suez Canal, that evacuated people from, the Lebanese people went via Cyprus and were brought right home. Likewise from Libya and from Egypt.
You know,
I think there is a certain degree of expertise and experience in dealing with this problem. Currently, I'm told that it is difficult to access many of these areas. But that measure, I have no doubt that measures would be taken and that the government would need to be in preparedness for whatever action it needs to take.
You know, ma'am, I was only breaking that point because if the crisis was to
whether by air or by any other means.
If the crisis was to spill outside the borders, then that entire region almost has about 7 million Indians, so to speak. But Mr. Manishankar Iyer, if I can bring you in, just as a quick response, are you satisfied as an opposition party?
I don't think we should press the panic button here. We're talking about Iraq.
Manishankar Iyer, if you can come in, are you satisfied with the government's response so far?
Well, there's not been very much of a government response, so I'm not going to criticize it. But I want to go beyond the First World War. I want to go back to the Battle of Qadisiyah, which resulted in the Arabs throwing the Persians behind the Zagros mountains. And Saddam Hussein called his battle with his war with Iran as the second Battle of Qadisiyah. So there are very long historical memories. And into this has come the complication that Iran has become a Shia country and a lot of the Arab world, if not all of it, is a Sunni country. And the leader of the Sunnis is Saudi Arabia. And as a result of American intervention in Iraq, a secular state has been overthrown and the Shias have been brought in direct proximity to the Sunnis. I fear that the issue is not narrowly one of whether ISIS have or have not reached southern Iraq, but of a conflagration which will consume the whole of West Asia in a Shia-Sunni war. I think that kind of scenario has to be planned for, even if it is a worst-case scenario.
A worst-case scenario. I think you've said it yourself. But Narendra Taneja, I'm going to give you the final word. I think panelists broadly agreeing with the first part of your statement that yes, it's not time to press the panic button, but the government needs to be more than prepared because the situation as it looks currently isn't going to die down in a couple of days.
Yes, I mean the government is very prepared. You see, the party is also very prepared, and therefore I think India is prepared. And look, I mean, people are talking, I mean, if we have to evacuate 6 million Indians from the Middle East, I think let's not kind of put those, let's not press the panic button. I think it's not really healthy, it's not good. Look at the situation there. Right now the situation is that, it's in northern part of Iraq, and Al-Qaeda-backed militants are getting closer to Baghdad. So it's a very, very worrisome situation, no doubt about it. But as I said earlier, I repeat the same thing. Companies are operating, oil is being produced, oil is being exported, and as far as the oil industry is concerned, southern part of Iraq, things are normal. I mean, that gives us reasons, for instance, to be optimistic. And I basically, as I said, that the government of India is consulting, other people are also consulting, countries which have got a large number of people working in southern part of Iraq and other parts of Iraq. Those things are going on, and I personally, as I said, let's not press the panic button. Let's be hopeful. At the same time, what is important is that we should be actually strengthening our diplomatic, efforts, and at the same time launching new diplomatic initiatives involving China, South Korea, and Japan, and the European Union.
Okay, so launching new diplomatic initiatives, and not time to press the panic button, but we are remaining prepared and aware. Gentlemen, Leela Ponnappa, thanks very much for joining me here on India at 9.